The talk show host thought he had the upper hand until Pam Bondi turned the tables, leaving him scrambling for a response. The studio lights were blinding and hotter than she had expected. Pam had been on television countless times, debated high-profile cases and faced crowds of reporters, but today felt different. There was a palpable tension in the air, something unsaid, as if the stage was set for a showdown. Pam adjusted her blazer and sat straight across from Graham Leighton, the host of The Exchange. Known for his sharp attire and sharp-edged questions, he was infamous for pushing guests to their breaking point, turning interviews into heated interrogations. Pam had been invited to discuss law, justice, and her time as Florida's Attorney General. However, from the moment she walked on set, it was clear that wasn't the real goal. The atmosphere was colder than usual, charged with an undercurrent of anticipation, as though the audience expected conflict. She caught sight of them for a moment, some faces eager, others skeptical, all waiting for sparks to fly. A producer gave the countdown. The red light flickered on. Graham flashed his practiced smile, his expression tight. "Pam, welcome to The Exchange," he said. She nodded politely. "Thank you for having me." Graham tapped his fingers lightly on the desk, his voice smooth but laced with a bite. "You've been at the center of controversy for a long time. Your tenure as Attorney General, your political stances. Some might argue your decisions have harmed more people than they've helped. Do you think that's fair? No build-up, no pleasantries, just a sharp-pointed attack right from the start." Pam had faced this kind of questioning before, but Graham's tone made it clear. He wasn't seeking a discussion. He wanted a confrontation. She held her composure. "I'd say that's an oversimplification of a complex body of work, but I'm happy to discuss specifics if you'd like." Graham gave a tight smirk, tilting his head. "Oh, we'll get to specifics, but let's start simple. A lot of people, especially those affected by your policies, feel you're out of touch with the realities of everyday Americans, that you've prioritized your political interests over what's right. Do you ever stop to think about the people on the other side of your decisions? It wasn't a question, it was bait." Pam didn't take the hook. She folded her hands on the desk. "Every decision I've made was to uphold the law and protect citizens. Leadership isn't about popularity. It's about doing what's necessary, even when it's unpopular." Graham let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. "Convenient answer, but let's be honest here, Pam." He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "Some might say you've ignored justice when it suited you." The room seemed to shrink. The audience was silent, hanging on every word. Pam remained still, unaffected. She had seen this tactic before. Force a reaction, rattle the guest, make them defensive. She wouldn't give him that satisfaction. She took a deep breath and met his gaze. "You seem eager to make this personal, Graham. I'd appreciate it if you'd allow me to answer your questions instead of just throwing accusations." A murmur ran through the crowd. Graham's expression flickered for a moment, but he wasn't done. He was about to make things even uglier. He had played this game before, steering the conversation, cornering guests without them even realizing it. Now he leaned back, crossing one leg over the other, preparing for the next move. "Pam, let's talk about power. People like you, politicians, prosecutors, claim to serve justice, but it often seems like justice bends for those with influence." Pam stayed firm, waiting. Graham continued, his voice sharpening. "For example, during your time as Attorney General, there were claims that corporate donors got special treatment, investigations that mysteriously disappeared, people who should have been held accountable, walking away untouched. Can you look this audience in the eye and say that never happened?" A trap, cleverly phrased, yet Pam knew better than to fall into it. She exhaled quietly, her voice even. "Graham, if you're going to make accusations, at least be specific. What cases are you referring to?" Graham smirked and turned to the camera as if performing for the viewers. "Oh, we'll get specific." "Don't worry," the audience chuckled, but the laughter wasn't lighthearted. It was expectant, as if they were waiting for her to slip up. Pam felt the shift in the room, but she stayed steady, unfazed. Graham flicked through a stack of papers in front of him. Props more than anything else. His theatrics were part of the act. He found his moment. Let's start with this. During your tenure, a lawsuit was filed against a corporation one of your donors accused of fraudulent business practices. Then suddenly, that lawsuit disappeared. What a coincidence. Pam's lips tightened. She knew exactly what he was referencing, and how he was twisting it. She opened her mouth to respond, but Graham cut her off. Tell me, Pam, why should Americans believe you didn't just protect the wealthy while the rest of us got left behind? The words hit hard. The audience murmured, sensing the tension rise. Pam could feel the trap closing in, but she stayed calm. This was the moment he had been waiting for, trying to get her on the defensive, but he had underestimated her. She took a slow breath and leaned forward slightly. You know, Graham, it's interesting how you frame this. You make it sound like some scandal, but the truth is the case was fully investigated and the claims didn't hold up. No cover-up, no conspiracy, just the legal process doing its job. But that wouldn't make for a very exciting headline, would it? The audience shifted. Whispers filled the air. The dynamic in the room had changed. Graham wasn't in control anymore. He wasn't done, though. If the political angle wasn't enough, he had one more card to play. He leaned back, casual now, like he was saving his best shot. Let's put politics aside for a moment and talk about character. You've built a reputation as a tough prosecutor, a woman of principle. But, what happens when those principles only apply when it's convenient? Pam didn't flinch. She knew where this was heading. Graham tilted his head, his voice now dripping with feigned curiosity. You've always talked about justice, about fairness. But do you remember the protests outside that movie theater in Tampa? Because a lot of people do. The room shifted. Pam's expression remained unchanged. She knew exactly what he was referring to. A summer evening when she had gone to a non-political documentary screening. Outside, protesters had waited. They shouted insults accusing her of ignoring their concerns, and someone spat at her. It had been captured on camera, and the footage had gone viral. Graham leaned in. People were angry. Some had lost everything because of policies you defended. And instead of engaging, you walked away. Some might call that cowardice. Pam exhaled, her voice controlled. Let's be clear, Graham. You're talking about a situation where I was harassed and physically assaulted. Are you suggesting I should have stood there and taken it? Graham raised an eyebrow, but Pam was undeterred. Because if you are, I'd love to hear you say it plainly. Let's not dance around it. Let's hear you defend mob intimidation on national television. Silence. For the first time, Graham hesitated. Pam had turned the tables. He tried to recover, but Pam wasn't finished. Desperation doesn't justify violence. Would you say the same if it had been a journalist or a politician you agreed with? Or do different rules apply depending on the target? Graham faltered. So you're playing the victim? Pam leaned back. I don't have to. The footage speaks for itself. But if you'd like a real conversation instead of twisting events for drama, I'm happy to have it. The audience was shifting in their seats. The power had clearly shifted and Graham could feel it, but he wasn't ready to give up. He quickly tried to pivot. Let's be honest, Pam. You've spent your career defending policies that a lot of Americans find problematic. If you weren't in politics, if you didn't have power, do you think you'd still be standing here today, or would you be just another person left behind by the system? Pam didn't blink. She tilted her head. You're saying because I worked in the system I somehow don't understand it? Graham smirked, sensing an opening. I'm saying you benefited from it. Pam leaned forward. You seem to have a lot of opinions about my past. Let me ask you something. What's your definition of justice? Graham faltered. Excuse me? Pam pressed on. You've been throwing accusations, implying I'm here because of privilege. So tell me, how do you define justice? Is it about who shouts the loudest, who makes the most noise, or is it about facts? Graham opened his mouth, but Pam continued. If you think the system is broken, what's your solution? You've had plenty of time to criticize, but what would you do differently? Graham shifted in his seat, clearly rattled. That's not my job, Pam. Exactly, Pam said with a knowing smile. Your job is to stir the pot, to create a spectacle. But let's get real. You don't care about justice. You care about headlines. The audience reacted. Some nodded in agreement. Others still. Skeptical, but Graham's grip on the conversation had slipped. Pam stood her ground. If you want a real discussion, we can have one. But if you just want sound bites, I'd hate to waste your time. The room was thick with tension. Graham forced a smile, trying to maintain control, but the audience could sense it. The tide had turned. Graham cleared his throat. Well, Pam, it seems you've made quite an impression here today. Pam met his gaze. I tend to do that. Graham, visibly irritated, wrapped things up. That's all the time we have. I appreciate you coming on and sharing your perspective. Pam smiled. Next time, maybe we can have a real conversation instead of a performance. The audience chuckled. Graham turned to the camera, voice tight. That was Pam Bondi, former Attorney General of Florida. We'll be right back after this. As the red light switched off, Graham slumped back in his chair. He was defeated. Pam stood, her composure intact. If you ever want a real conversation, let me know, he scoffed. I asked the questions people wanted answered. Pam smiled softly. No, you ask the questions that get clicks. With that, she walked off set, the weight of the moment behind her. The room had seen it. Pam had flipped the script.